ministry in a Chinese church. So my name is Justin Young. I'm from Indianapolis in Indiana. Who's ever been to Indiana? No, okay, a few of you have been to Indiana. There's really no reason to go there. So I work at the Chinese Community Church of Indianapolis, and my wife and I have 3 children. The oldest of whom is 12 now. So he's in our youth group now. So youth ministry has become very personal for me because now I have a family member actually involved in our youth group. So let me tell you a story, a little bit about my story, and then I want to hear a little bit about your story. So I became a Christian when I was about 11 years old, and once I became a Christian, I wanted just to know more about the Bible, and so I just was really hungry to study Scripture. And so when I went to college, I actually majored in biblical and theological studies. I majored in studying the Bible. But I had no plan or aspirations to go into ministry in college. I just thought, I just really want to learn about the Bible. I want to study the Bible. And then I realized my senior year of college that, oh, wow, I have to do something next year. Like, I'm graduating college. I need to either get a job or go to graduate school. And so all of a sudden, I had to make this decision. And so the spring semester of my senior year, I was applying for 2 different jobs. On the one hand, I was applying for a computer programming job in the north side of Chicago. And this really interested me. This was during the time in which technology was really growing. There was this tech boom. On the other hand, there was this church in Indianapolis, which is where I grew up, a Chinese church which was looking for their first youth director. Now, so my dad's Chinese, he's from the Philippines, my mom's American. And so growing up, we were somewhat connected with the Chinese community in Indianapolis. We didn't go to this church, but we were connected with people in the Chinese community there. And so we had friends that went to this church, and they told my parents about, oh, there's this job here. Would Justin be interested in it? And so I had no experience in youth ministry. I thought youth ministry was just like playing games with teenagers and eating pizza. I was like, oh, I don't know. And beyond that, I really wasn't connected to the Chinese community, honestly. But particularly my mom encouraged me, well, just apply. And so I applied, okay? And so I did not get the computer programming job, but I was invited to serve at the Chinese church. And so, okay, wow. And so what I'm going to share today are a lot of my mistakes, honestly. Because when I started working there, I was 21 years old. I had no experience in youth ministry. And this is so crazy. One of my first memories of like the first day serving at the church now was the senior pastor comes up to me and he shakes my hand and says, Justin, I trust you. Do whatever you want. Which is just crazy, right? I'm so young. I don't know anything. But he trusted me, and they were very gracious. They are very gracious to me. And so what I want to share today are some of my own mistakes so that you don't have to make those same mistakes. So that's just a little bit about my story. I thought just real briefly, I want to hear a little bit about your story. And so if we could just go around briefly, just say your name, the church, and why did you pick this workshop? Because there's 2 other great workshops, but why did you pick this workshop? Okay, so your name, your church, and why are you at this workshop? So it's okay, we'll start with you.
My name is Qing Wen Wang. I came from the Augusta Chinese church. Why I come here? Because I involved in the children ministry. Okay. I think that 1 year ago, we have reached out. So I see a lot of kids playing in the hallway. So I think, well, that is a good chance to preach to them. So we started, at that time we started children ministry. So I have some sister, we work together, and we had a VBS, the first VBS this July, and all the kids and the families love it. So I think we have a lot of mistakes, and I want to learn more.
Sure, great.
My name is Xu Sen. I came from Columbia, South Carolina, living in Chinese church. I'm the youth minister in our church, and I want to do it better, so I come here.
Hi, my name is Cindy Chen. I come from Chinese Bible Church in North Carolina. We're right now in Apex, North Carolina. I come mostly because I'm not involved in our youth ministry. We actually have the 2 a young couple that they are actually American, and we're very fortunate to have them. But I always feel that I have been involved in children ministry for many, many years. And I actually feel the youth ministry is very, very important. Now, I see a lot of young people who they seem to demonstrate a strong interest in Christ. But after they get into college, they've lost the interest. They don't go to church anymore. Or they don't even proclaim they're Christians. I feel very, very sad. I feel the youth ministry is an important link between children and college before they go out of home. And I just like to learn more to find out what I can do to help.
Yeah, my name is Peter Lo. I came from Blacksburg Chinese Church. I'm working with, currently I'm working with college students. Like Cindy, I see the need for the high school, middle school ministry because of so many of them drift away when they are in college.
Hi, my name is Peter Zhang from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I've been teaching youth Bible study for close to 10 years. We're a small church. I've been teaching these kids, seeing them growing. It's really cool. Okay. Thank you.
My name is Tie Peng Lu from China. Right now we are in Colombia, and we join the local church, Grace Point, and they have a very good Sunday school system. So, and I have two children. I have a very strong interest in youth ministry. Since my major is Christian education. So,
I'm working as a seminary student in Columbia International University, and I am attending an American church called St. Andrew's Church. And I'm here because I don't feel like to go to the other team.
That works. That's totally fine. That's good. Thanks for your honesty. That's good.
Okay, hi. My name is Claire. I'm come from Charleston Chinese Church. One of the reasons I come here is because I'm so-called first generation Christian. So we have the struggle. We know the struggle. But for my son, he's the second generation Christian, which is he's struggling. Why I have the struggle and he doesn't have it at all. So I find out there's a gap here between religious life and spiritual life. And all he knows, not only, not from us, not from his parents, but from his friends and from other people. He only knows about the religious life. He doesn't know about the spiritual life. So I just wondering if there's the answer between this gap. I want to combat this too. So one day when he goes to college, he will know that anybody can do that, but I don't. Not because my mom says so, because God says so. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Sure. Very good.
My name is Lester. Come from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The reason I come here, one main reason is my son stopped going to church as a teenager. So I really think that it's important to have a good youth ministry with children.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. Here's an outline. I know not everyone will be here tomorrow, but let me just, if you will be here tomorrow, let me just tell you what we're talking about both tomorrow and today. Today we're talking about the why, the what, and how. Just briefly, why would you want to have a youth ministry? And a lot of you have already given some good thoughts to that. What is a youth ministry? And then really focus on most of our time on, well, how do you develop a youth ministry? Tomorrow, we're going to think about the benefits of a small ministry. Because I heard that most who come here come from churches that are smaller. And I think a lot of times we feel like, oh, we're a small church, we don't have the resources. But I want to suggest tomorrow that there are actually some really great benefits about being at a small church. And so we'll talk about that tomorrow. So let's start with this first question, why? Why would you even think about having a youth ministry? And it's interesting, a number of you mentioned what I think is a very compelling reason. So there was a study done by Barna. Barna does different research. And in this article entitled, The Priority, Challenges, and Trends in Youth Ministry, look at these quotes. Millennials are leaving the church. So millennials are young adults. Millennials are leaving the church, but look how the quote continues. Nearly 6 in 10 young people who grew up in Christian churches end up walking away. And the unchurched segment among millennials has increased in the last decade from 44%, 52%, marrying a larger cultural trend away from church going in America. And so, some of you mentioned, you know someone, you see students walking away from the faith, particularly when they hit college. And honestly, that's true for us in our church. The stat here was about 60%. I had somebody in our church look at our different generations, and we're right there. We're right about 50% of our students that grow up in our church, once they hit college, for whatever reason, they drift away from church. A couple more quotes, some good news though in this article. The good news is that research we conducted points to a strong correlation between good, integrated youth ministry and staying active in church. And so what they found is that the stronger your youth ministry is, that there's at least a correlation between combating that trend. That is, they will persevere once they hit college. And one more aspect of this article, the level of priority among pastors correlated very highly with the size of the group. And this is my highlight. Churches that have not made the youth ministry a priority tend to have smaller youth groups. And they say, this does not prove causation, but at least suggests a connection between youth group size and prioritization. And so I'm excited because you're here and some of you are leaders in your church, and at least you can be a champion for or a voice for youth ministry, because if no one champions youth ministry, it's just going to fall by the wayside. Let's be honest, youth ministry is hard. A lot of you are maybe ministering in a different country, in a different language, in a different time, and it's just like these youth. I had one parent talk to me many years ago when I just started and just saying, these youth are just a headache. Like they're just such a pain, right? And so unless someone, maybe you, takes this issue and says, no, it has to be a prioritization because we don't want our second generation, the next generation to fall away from following the Lord. And so simply put, the why is because we have been entrusted with the gospel and we want to help this next generation persevere in following Jesus even as they become young adults in college. And youth ministry is one way that can help. Second question is, what? Well, what is a youth ministry? And so let me ask you that question. From a very bare bones, basic perspective, what do you have to have a youth ministry? So for example, do you have to have a big building? No. So you tell me, what do you need to have at the very, very minimum to have a youth ministry? If you don't need a big building, I agree. Well, what do you think? What's one thing you must have if you need to have a youth ministry?
Teenagers.
Yeah, you need to have youth, right? You need to have youth, at least for right now. So if in your church you have no youth, probably tomorrow you're not going to have a youth ministry unless you do some outreach. And because, probably unless you live in a very unique part of the country, there's probably some youth around somewhere. But yeah, that's a point well taken. You need some youth. Do you need anything else from the bare bones? Or that's about it. Do you
need
think?
to have good youth parents.
Okay.
That would want their children to continue.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you think you need a youth pastor? Is that necessary?
Leader.
You need a leader? Okay. But maybe not necessarily a pastor? Good.
Well, I think it's always good to have a youth pastor,
Mhm.
but not necessarily have
Yeah.
the funding to support.
That's right, because again, if a lot of us are from smaller churches, maybe you don't even have a Mandarin speaking pastor, and so much less a youth pastor. So yeah, so the very basic, I think you have highlighted it well. You need some youth, you need some type of leadership, or maybe some adults that can care for these youth. So if that's the idea, if we have some type of leadership, some adults pouring into these youth, caring for these youth, okay, if we have that, what do we do now? Like, how do we build out a youth ministry? So I want to suggest 7 different foundations that I found over the years that these are really pivotal in building up a healthy youth ministry. And the more of these you have, the stronger your youth ministry will be. And they're roughly, I'm going to share them roughly in order of prioritization. Roughly, not totally, but roughly. And so 7 foundations, the more of these you have, the stronger I think your youth ministry will be. And again, these are from my mistakes. I didn't start out thinking, I have all this in mind. So learn from my mistakes. The first one probably isn't surprising if you've been in ministry before, but it's one that you might at least internally kind of like, oh yeah, of course. What's the next one? But let's pause and think about this one a little bit. The first one is simply prayer. Like let me ask you this question. In your ministry, do you pray for your ministry, or do you do your ministry through prayer? Or in other words, is prayer part of your ministry, or do you do all of your ministry undergirded by prayer? Is prayer part of your ministry? Like some people think, okay, my ministry is to teach Sunday school, clean up after lunch, and pray for my people. Is it just one part of your ministry, or do you do all of your ministry through prayer? Because I think a lot of times, for me, I would default to the first one. Oh yeah, I should pray for my people. But I want to challenge us to develop a perspective on ministry where, no, prayer is not just part of my ministry, but prayer undergirds all of my ministry. Why? Because prayer shows our dependence on God. It's been said that prayerlessness is our declaration of independence from God. That is, when we don't pray, it shows, well, God, I don't really need you. But if you've been in ministry, if you've served at all, you know that's not true. You know we need God for everything. We know that apart from God, we can do nothing. And so I want to challenge all of us as we're thinking about youth ministries, we're thinking about ministry in general, that we don't just make prayer part of the ministry, but rather all that we do that comes out of a heart of prayer, comes out of a heart of dependence on God. That God, if you don't move, if you don't work, then this is not going to work. In fact, for the other 6 that I'm going to mention in a few moments, you could do all those things, but if you don't have this heart of prayer, this heart of depending on God, honestly, you could have a pretty good youth ministry. People would say, oh, good job, good job. But if there's not that heart of prayer, if there's not that heart of dependence on God, it's probably going to be pretty empty. It's probably going to be pretty shallow. It's probably going to be hollow. Okay, so I want to pause right here and just say, we need to start and say, God, we need you to minister to these youth, to these college students. We can't do this on our own. And so to play this out, I want to actually read part of Psalm 78, which is a helpful prayer in which the psalmist is thinking about this next generation. And then I'm going to pray for us. Right? I'm going to spend a few minutes of our time together, of our short time together, and we're going to pray at the very beginning. So let me read Psalm 78, and then I'll pray for us. So the psalmist says this, my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth to the parable. I will utter hidden things from of old. He's inviting us in. Listen. What does he say? Things we have heard and know, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. So the psalmist says, listen, we need to tell the next generation about the Lord. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded for our ancestors to teach their children, so that the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. And they, in turn, would tell their children. So there's this theme throughout the history of God's people that this generation tells that generation, and that generation is called to tell the next generation the things of the Lord. But they would then put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. So do you hear these twin ideas in Psalm 78? There's this desire to make sure we pass on this faith to the next generation, and also this warning that that this next generation wouldn't be like the previous generation. What's interesting, maybe in your churches, at least in my church, a lot of people are the first generation Christian. I think Claire, you mentioned you're the first generation Christian. And so there's this idea that for the next generation, we want you to follow the Lord, unlike maybe the previous generations. Because you're the first Christian in your family, and your church is made up of people who are the first Christians, and you want something to change here. You want this faith to be passed on to the next generation. You want the next generation to be different than the previous generations. And that's the heart of the psalmist here, at least in the opening 8 verses. So what I want to do, I want to pray for us. I want to pray for our youth ministries, just to set this tone of, if we don't have a heart of dependence on God, then whatever we do in ministry, including youth ministry, it's going to be empty. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for the responsibility you've given us as people who have a heart for this next generation. Lord, we thank you for changing our lives, for transforming our lives with the good news of the gospel. That though we were dead in our sin, yet there is forgiveness and life in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that through your Holy Spirit we can cry out, Abba, Father. Father, we personally have experienced this transformation. We desire for the next generation to also experience this transformation. That they would be faithful. That they would not just know your works, but they would know you intimately. And so, Father, as we think about youth ministry from the very beginning, right here, we just pause and we say, Father, we ask that you would move in and through our churches, move in and through whatever ministry we have to the next generation, to affect the next generation, help them to follow you. Lord, for many of us in our churches, we might be one of the first Christians. And so we ask that what you did in our generation, you would do the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. Father, open their eyes to your glory, to your majesty, to your beauty, to your grace, to your mercy, and to your love. And help them to have a faith that is real. Lord, be real to them. And I pray that even the rest of our discussion this afternoon would be helpful with that goal of passing the faith on to the next generation. That they would know your mighty acts. That they would know you, the true living God who loves them. So we commit this time to you, knowing full well and declaring our dependence on you, knowing that apart from you, we can do nothing. For this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So prayer. You know, if you do nothing else, like let's say you don't have any formal ministry, but you go away and you go back to your church and say, hey, maybe to some of the leaders, some parents, let's spend time praying each week for our teenagers, our children. Hey, that's a great start. That's a great start. Number two, this was mentioned actually, parents. Why do you need to impact the parents? Like, aren't we talking about youth ministry? Don't we need to impact the youth? Yes, but to impact the youth, you've got to impact the parents. Now, I understand for some of you, the parents they're not Christians, they don't come to your church, but for some of you, you have youth that have parents in the church. So I'm talking particularly about those parents, or that are connected somehow to the church. Parents are the most influential people in the lives of their youth. Why? Well, let's just do a little, let me show you a little graph here. It says the average church only has 40 hours in a given year to influence a life. So think about the 40 hours. 52 weeks a year, a family will come maybe around 40 times when you think about vacation, being sick, etc. So let's say they come about 40 times a year, and they come for a gathering of about 1 hour. So they get about 40 times, 40 hours in a year. In contrast, a parent has 3,000 hours per year to influence a life. So what do you think? Who has more influence, 40 hours a year or 3,000 hours? The parent has more influence because he or she is just more present with and spends more time with the youth. So if we want to influence the youth, we've got to influence the parents. And some of you are thinking, if you have teenagers, you're like, well, my teenagers don't like me. They don't want to talk to me. I'm not cool enough. And that's fair. I hear that a lot. There's a study done about a decade ago, but I still think it's accurate, by MTV. And they asked teenagers this question. Tell us how happy or unhappy each of the following makes you. Okay, so they asked teenagers, how happy or unhappy does this make you? And they gave them this idea. Your relationship with your parents. In other words, how happy or unhappy does your relationship with your parents make you? Now, if you have teenagers, you might think, well, they're going to be like, all of them will say they're unhappy with their parents because it seems like teenagers hate their parents. Well, actually, at least in this study, 73% said, my relationship with my parents makes me either very happy or somewhat happy. Now, again, if you have teenagers, they won't tell you this, probably, because they're too cool, they don't want to talk to you. But down the road, they look back, and your presence in their life makes a difference. And so one of the things that we've tried to leverage in Indianapolis is really impacting the parents. And so one of the resources I came across is this website called Ministry to Parents. And they provide some resources in terms of equipping and encouraging parents. And so one of the things that we started to do is invite parents to sign up for what we call an online parenting class. And all that means is about twice a month they get an email And once a month they have one of the emails has a video that just encourages them and equips them as a parent, just as a way to encourage and equip parents and say, we love you parents, you're the most influential person in the life of your team. I want to show you a sample of one of these videos that we recently sent out just to some parents that wanted some encouragement and some equipping. And I'll turn it up so hopefully you can hear it.
I know it may be hard to believe, but there are times when teenagers are sitting around a room and no one is talking and they're still having a conversation. You know how they're doing it? They're texting each other. That seems crazy, doesn't it? I mean, as we grew up, we didn't have the texting stuff, so we actually had to talk to each other. But in the world our teenagers are growing up in, the written word is just as powerful as the spoken word. Now that's something for us to get used to because that may not have been as true for us. But it's a really cool principle I'd like to lay out for you today that maybe, just maybe, if you're having trouble connecting to your teenager with spoken words, you might try the written word. Now you did this possibly when they were younger and they would take their lunch to school. You might have written a lunch note, put it in the lunch bag, or at least you've heard of people who have done that. And it's just a little special note or a little moment from the heart where you share a written word. Well, I want you to think about how you can do that for a teenager. I don't know if they're taking their lunch bag. Maybe a lunch note will work. But I want to give you 5 other ways really quickly that you can use the written word to connect to your teenager. The first one is obvious. Use text messaging. Now, again, for us, this may not be as fluent of a language, but for them, texting is so normal and natural, even more so than talking. So instead of fighting it, why don't you try it and text them some encouraging words, some scriptures, or some of the things from your heart that you want to share with them and you actually want them to hear. Secondly is a mirror note. Wherever they get ready in the morning, to be able to just write an encouraging word on a post-it note, stick it on their mirror. It's a nice surprise, it's not overwhelming, and it's just something that they could just have a good feeling about that you took some time to do. In a very similar way, the third one is to slide a note under their pillow at night. I don't know what it is, but many times teenagers are more open to conversation and receiving words before they go to bed. That's not true for everybody, but a lot of times that is true. So while they're away at school, slide a note under their pillow for them to discover that might have also encouragement, scripture, and the things that you want to share from your heart. Now, third is to send them a package in the mail. Now that is something that they don't experience a lot anymore. Everything's so electronic and digital. We don't ever get real mail. And especially your teenager probably hasn't gotten a lot of real mail. So to write them a letter and to give them a care package of some sort and send it to them in the mail is a way for them to receive your words in an interesting and fun way, and they might just be more open to it. Now finally, and I think this is a really cool one, you can gather letters from other people. Let's say they're having a birthday or a special occasion is coming up. Instead of just you writing a letter, you can find people, their friends, and people they respect and love, or family members, and just ask them, would y'all write a short note real quick? And then gather those notes, and then share them on that special occasion. All of those have one thing in common. It's a written word. I don't know why, but teenagers sometimes like written words more than spoken words. I sometimes wish that weren't true. But for a lot of teenagers, it is. And so what that means is, as a parent, you need to be strategic and use the written word to share your heart.
So that's just an example of a video that was sent out a couple months ago. Each month has a different theme. And just a way to, again, equip and encourage parents. If you want to jump on this, if you want to actually see what we actually do, you feel free. Here's a URL. You can subscribe as a parent and just kind of see what this is like. And just happy to share that with you. Another cool thing that this website has is different resources to, again, encourage and equip parents. Let me tell you a story about something we did in 2014. They have a resource called Parent of the Month. And so what we did, again, we're trying to encourage parents because we know parents are the most influential person in the life of their teens. In May of 2014, during one of our youth group times, we invited all of the students to write down and nominate one of their parents for Parent of the Month. So for example, my dad should be Parent of the Month because he helps do this and that. And then some of our other coworkers read them and selected, like I believe 12 Parent of the Month. And then what we did, we went and we surprised these parents at their door, and we gave them a gift, and we sang them a song, and we read the letter from their child to them. I want to show you one of these videos because even if the parent's not a Christian, this just encourages them and shows, hey, this church that my kid's going to cares about me as a parent and loves me. And so let me just show you this video of one example of what happened when we did this to one of these parents. They don't know this is happening. It's a surprise. Just an example of some of the resources here and ways you can encourage parents. Again, just think about what this could do for the culture in your church. Even if you don't have a youth ministry, maybe the parents want one, but they're kind of against it because it would cost money and whatever. But man, what if you just started with prayer and honoring the parents and encouraging the parents and equipping the parents? I wonder if that would soften some hearts and be like, well, maybe we should think about the youth now. So, prayer, parents. Okay. Third is you need people. Ministry is not done in a vacuum, and you know that. You know that God didn't just drop a book from heaven. He came himself in his son, took on flesh, and relationships matter. And so you need people to help a youth ministry. And usually the people, this is what I think of when I think of what do we need besides youth and parents. I usually think of, we call them like youth co-workers. And I usually think of like young adults that are like really cool and hip and ABC and all that. And that's important, we'll talk about that. But I want to suggest two other genres of people that you can leverage and that are really important in your youth ministry, and that actually you can start with even tomorrow. So some of the people that you need to leverage in youth ministry are other adults who are not youth leaders. What I mean is this, let me give you a quote and then I'll tell you what this means. one author says is youth ministry is not about finding an extra place for yet another ministry, but about finding a place for youth within every ministry. In other words, this author is suggesting that one way you can do youth ministry is by taking the youth that you have and integrating them into the life of your church. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but one of the ideas could be maybe you have a worship service and you have a bulletin and you have people hand the bulletin out. You could have a youth hand out the bulletin. Maybe you have a soundboard to operate the mics and maybe some PowerPoint or whatever. You could have a youth help out there alongside an adult. And so as he or she does that, he or she forms some type of relationship with an adult and starts to see, oh, this is what it looked like to follow Jesus faithfully as an adult, because I know Mr. So-and-so or Auntie So-and-so. And when you start doing this, you build this web around different teenagers. So for example, here's an illustration that I found. Here's the youth, and a healthy youth has different adults investing in this case, him. So again, in the picture, there's maybe a teacher at school, a coach, a soccer coach, maybe a youth pastor, certainly parents, grandparents, uncle, aunts, but other adults. The more adults you can have connecting with youth, the better. Let me give you an example. So this morning, my 12-year-old son ran a half marathon. And so I'm not able to be there with him, but I'm so thankful because one of my friends who's about my age was able to take him to the marathon, and I'm sure they talked, driving down and driving back. And so I want different men, for example, to invest in the life of my son. Let me give you another example. So we're part of a small group, my wife and I. And the other the other men in that group talk to my son and just try to build into him informally. There's no specific defined ministry there. It's just life. And so he gets to know other older adults who are trying to follow Jesus. And so integrating youth into the life of the church is one way to have a youth ministry. Maybe there's not a separate youth group, but rather the whole church is part of their own life and formation. Another people group that you can leverage to build your youth ministry are the youth themselves. Youth can mentor other youth. So about 4 years ago or so, I came across this book called One-to-One Bible Reading by David Helm, and it's actually available in Chinese as well. And the gist behind one-to-one Bible reading is very, very, very simple. David Helm simply says, hey, let's read the Bible one-to-one with each other. And so I asked some of my students then, hey, would you like to do this? And so one of the students, whose name is Dennis, was in high school then. So I challenged him, would you read the Bible with other students? And so he began to read the Bible with a middle schooler who was in grade 7, whose name is Raphael. Well, so time has passed now. Dennis is in college now. Raphael is now in high school. I want to show you a video. I interviewed Raphael recently, and I asked him about this. And so listen to Raphael as he talks about that first one-to-one Bible reading that he had with Dennis and what has happened since.
Hi, I'm Raphael Lee. I'm a 10th grader at Carmel High School. Dennis was a senior in high school and I was in 7th grade. So this was the summer of 6th, 7th grade, and I went to our church summer retreat called MCCA. And Dennis already approached my friend and asked to read the Bible with him. And I was kind of jealous. I was like, wait a minute, he didn't ask me. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna brush it aside. Because MCCA for me was mostly about fun and not really about God and that time. So Dennis arranged my friend to have a Bible study with him. And then I was like, wait a minute, I feel really jealous of this. So I was like, hey, Chris, my friend, can I come along as well? And then he was like, yeah, why not? And then I guess that's how I started. The first time I met him was through a friend, and we just had a Bible study together. And I think for me, the biggest part, the coolest part about the first time was how I thought it'd be 20 minutes, just read the Bible and discuss the basic points. But we spent an hour on half a chapter, and I was like, whoa, that's really cool, because I've never thought the Bible as extremely hard. I've always thought it was really basic, all the answers are Sunday school answers. But I think with him it was you really just dive in depth and you really know what's going on with that. So after the first time, after just meeting him, he was like, why don't we just do weekly Bible meetings? And they were online, so for me it was every Wednesday at 8 o'clock we just meet for an hour and discuss a chapter in the Bible. Matthew, and we're all 10th graders. And I think the goal for that one is like we're kind of leaders in this church. We're like not like the middle school kids we used to be. So it's like we gotta like start taking responsibility, like taking responsibility in the church. So it's like the best way to do that probably would be like the start of the Bible study. Because after Dennis left and like graduated to college, we didn't really have this anymore because like he was always the leader. It wasn't us leading, it was him leading and us following. So after he left, it was like, how are we gonna do this? So we kind of stopped. But I feel like now that we're in like sophomores in 10th grade, it's like we need to like start doing like leadership thing. We're like the example of the middle school is like up to now. So we need to like present a good image about like who God is. So I think the meeting with Chris and Matthew is mostly about like each week a different one of us leads the Bible study. So each week one person prepares like questions in advance, like prepares like reads the chapter and like talks about it. So I think like it's us kind of like trying to gain responsibility and like trying to like gain leadership skills in helping the Bible. And the one I do with Jaden, he's a 6th grader in my small group right now, and I think it's important, like for me, I thought it was like really cool that it's like when I was in 7th grade, like he's in 6th grade, like that I get to meet with like someone who's like so much older and so much more knowledgeable. So I think meeting with Jaden is a lot about like just like kind of teaching him like about God and like straying away from like the basic answers that we are like so accustomed to. Because I find that a lot of times has been like after like elementary school and after you go to like the church or like the church life and you join the youth group, a lot of times your answers are like super God loves you or God loves everyone. It's not really like why and like the deeper questions. So I think starting one with Jaden was kind of to help him like grow as a Christian, but also like prepare him to like the same way I did, like the same way Dennis like approached me when I was young. I want to approach someone when they're young, so like they can grow and like be mature as a Christian.
So did you hear what he said at the end? In the same way as Dennis discipled me, I want to in turn disciple someone younger than me. And this is not a formal ministry. I told him about this book, and not all of them caught on clearly. These are just some bright spots, if you will. So Dennis caught on and discipled Raphael. And again, did you hear? They meet online. They meet in the Google Hangout. And now Raphael, having seen that model, is doing the same thing with both some friends, some peers, but also Jaden, who's in grade 6. I couldn't help but think of 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul writes to Timothy, "The things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." How many generations are being touched here? Paul is teaching Timothy, 1, 2, who is then to teach, entrust that the gospel to reliable people, that's 3 generations, who then will be qualified to teach others. There's 4 generations here. Like, this is what our vision should be, not just in youth ministry, but in the church. Disciple-making disciples. People who get this and want to pass the faith on to the next generation. And so, obviously, not every youth is going to buy into this, but there might be some who cast this vision. You say, hey, this is not a formal ministry. You just go and do this. You mentor. Another way you can leverage your own teenagers, let's say you have teenagers and you don't have any adults that really want to help out, but the teenagers want to have a youth group, you say, okay, you lead the youth group. So there's a book by Jonathan McKee and David Smith simply about this. Like, how would you encourage your teenagers? How would you frame this so that they take leadership? Well, here's a book that talks about that. There's another book that we're using right now in terms of training youth leaders. This is simply called Help, I'm a Student Leader. And so what we're doing is once, I think a quarter or once every other month, we're meeting together, all the student leaders. These are people in high school, and we read a chapter, and we talk about it. And so what you could do is, let's say you don't have a youth group, you want a youth group, but you're not sure if any adults you don't have enough adults. You say to the youth, we want you to own this. You take ownership of your group. And maybe you provide a little bit of oversight, a little bit of guidance, and you give them this book, and you say, here's some training. Why don't you plan one event? Well, why don't you lead a Bible study once a month? Just start there. But you give them ownership and say, hey, you take care of this. The third genre of people are youth leaders. These, again, in my mind, this is what I typically think of when I think of youth group, like leaders. Are those people that are often young adults or young at heart, that love youth, that love Jesus. And so the questions that you ask when you think about youth leaders is, what role will they play? For example, some adults are really good at administration and planning. Let them play that role. Some of them are really good at leading small groups. And so, for example, right now in our church, we have some adults that are involved, and we leverage them as small group leaders. When we come together on Friday nights, we break into small groups. And so, just as a resource, we're using a resource called Lead Small, in which we're training these adult leaders to how do you lead your group well? How do you really care about the small group that has been entrusted to you? Now, let me just pause there. There's been a lot of information, but notice, we focus on 3 of these 7 pillars: prayer, parents, and people. We haven't talked about hiring a youth pastor. We haven't talked about playing games. We haven't talked about eating pizza, right? And so these are helpful foundations here. And I just want to emphasize these because this is something you could do pretty readily. You don't need a big building. You don't need a lot of money. You just kind of cast this vision and see what sticks. Now, we will pick up quicker now. Let me finish quickly through the last 4. So if you have those. Beyond that, you need to plan. You need to have some kind of a structure, some kind of guideline. Not just guidelines, but some structure to build upon. So for example, this past summer, we tried to grow tomatoes. Maybe you grow tomatoes. And I'm not a gardener, but I think I know that when you're growing tomatoes, you have a trellis or like a wire frame that the tomato plant grows up. That's what we're talking about here. If you want the ministry to grow and to be healthy, there has to be some type of framework that it can grow upon. And let me suggest a few. These are taken from a book called Sustainable Youth Ministry, when he talks about some things that are really helpful to build a youth ministry that seem very kind of basic. One is you need a directory where you know who, like the youth names, what school they go to, like their email, their mobile number. That's really helpful. You need to update this directory, and so that you can kind of have a framework for, well, who are the youth that we have? Now, right now, some of you have 5 youth in your church. You're like, why do we need a directory? Well, if you want to grow, if you want to keep track of their friends and you can follow up, then you want to have this structure piece here. As a brief aside, so I looked a long time for a directory for a whole church. Just real briefly, it sounds like an ad. It's on an ad. We found one. It's called Breeze, CHMS. Really helpful, targeted to small and medium-sized churches, very inexpensive, very easy to use. And so we use this for the whole church, including the youth. One of the reasons I like it is because when you put people in there, you can put them into groups. And what's cool is, at least for us, sometimes youth need rides. Like they can't drive. And so I can pull up real quickly, where do all the youth live? Oh, so let's say we have a guest come and she's from this right here. Like, oh, there's 3 people around here that can give you a ride. So just having that in place helps you grow and do well as a youth ministry. You need job descriptions as well. As you start to grow, think about the roles you want, and then define what you want done in that role. So again, start very simple. Maybe you want one person to lead a Bible study. So just have a very simple, results-focused job description. And this, as an aside, this also is helpful for an annual review. Not that we're a business, but people want to know how they're doing. And so if you give them a template for, here, this is what I want you to do for leading Bible study, you put on paper, and then in 6 months, a year, you can bring it out again and be like, how's this going? A third thing that would be helpful for planning is simply a recruiting list. Like, we all want more volunteers, but we don't put time into thinking about how to get volunteers. So one way is to have a recruiting list. Like, you just write down all the people that you can think that would be helpful to fill, for example, to lead a Bible study for the youth. And by the way, ask your youth, who would you want to lead a Bible study? And that will give you some good ideas. But just have this list here, and so you're always thinking about who can we recruit. Fourth, you need a calendar. You need to plan out a calendar. And the calendar can be, I think, has 3 tiers here. One part of it is training. If you have a volunteer, if you finally recruit a Bible study leader, it helps to train that leader. We've all been called into roles where we didn't feel like we were equipped well enough, and it's not a win. You start failing and dropping balls, and it's not good. So you want to have a training calendar where you say, hey, once every quarter, we're going to read a chapter from this book and talk about it. That's the training. Or we're going to read an article and talk about it. As you get more developed, a curriculum calendar would be helpful as well. This is simply lays out what you're going to teach and when you're going to teach. We have this in school. Like, if you have kids in school, they have a curriculum. Most churches, some churches don't have a curriculum, which seems a bit odd. Look at this quote. Imagine what would happen if schools taught this with the same approach to curriculum that most churches use. One year, a teacher stumbles onto an engaging curriculum in verbs with some really cool videos on gerunds. When the kids and teachers get bored with that curriculum, they cut it short, and the teacher runs to the curriculum store, finds a compelling study in algebraic equations, and so she teaches that the next week. When the study is winding down, the teacher decides it's time to teach on rocks, or medieval knights, or Christmas around the world. This sounds crazy because you've been in school, you know, in grade 3 they teach this math, in grade 4 they teach this math, etc., etc., etc. In the church, we need to have a curriculum in mind. For example, with your students, you have maybe 6, 7 years with them. What do you want them to know at the end of 6 to 7 years? That's a curriculum, that's a scope, that's a sequence. And the final piece for the calendar is simply like events. If you're going to have one special event, get it on the calendar and build up to it so that you know what's happening. Number 5, precautions. Nothing will sink your youth ministry quicker than some type of safety issue happening that you could have either prevented or helped guard against. Unfortunately, every once in a while in the news, you hear about a volunteer at a church having an inappropriate relationship with a child or with a student, and then maybe there was not even a background check done, and you're like, wow, if you're thinking about finding a church, would you go to that church? Would you send your child to that church? I don't know. One of the first books I read when I started youth ministry was this book called Better Safe Than Sued, talking about here are some safety things you need to think about in student ministry. And so, for example, background checks for volunteers, waivers for participants if you go out on like a retreat or something, and then just having some common sense guidelines. For example, like we don't let youth drive other youth. Like if we're going to a retreat, we either have adults drive or we rent a bus. Like teenagers should not be driving other teenagers. Again, you're learning from my mistakes. Many years ago, we played this game at one of our retreats in which they were blindfolded and had to run around. Bad idea. What happened was one of our youth, who's a big guy, ran into one of our girls, and she got knocked down, and everything seemed okay, but she kept having headaches and headaches, and she had this long ordeal of finding out what was causing, because the impact of that hit messed something up with her skull or something that gave her headaches for quite a while. So we don't play blindfold games anymore. There's a game called Chubby Bunny, which a lot of youth groups play. Chubby Bunny is this game where you take a marshmallow and you put it in your mouth and say, Chubby Bunny. And the goal of the game is to keep putting as many marshmallows as you can into your mouth and see how long you can keep saying Chubby Bunny without laughing and letting all the marshmallows fall out. And so it's an old youth group game. We don't play that game because it's just so dangerous, right? Kids are going to choke and whatever. So just common sense is so important because nothing can derail your ministry quicker than some safety thing happening that really shouldn't have happened. Number 6, and we haven't mentioned number 6 yet because I think the others are more important, frankly, is you could always hire a youth pastor. And I know a lot of our churches are not that place where you have the funds or the desire or the vision to hire a youth pastor. That's fine, but maybe someday you will. But for now, I would say, rather than hire a youth pastor, what you could do is use the money that you might put into hiring or paying a pastor part-time or full-time is to invest in the volunteers you have or invest in the youth ministry. If you ever find yourself wanting to hire a youth pastor, a really great book is simply called Before You Hire a Youth Pastor. And it lays out a process in which you can find a good fit for a youth pastor. Because a lot of churches think, oh, we have a difficult time with the youth. Let's just hire a youth pastor and he'll just fix everything. That's probably not going to happen. And so this church will help guard you from that. Lastly, the last foundation is patience. This will not happen overnight. You're not going to build a youth ministry overnight. You need perseverance. There's going to be lots of ups. There's going to be lots of downs. And so the last pillar that I was just patience. It's just going to take time, as with anything, for this youth ministry to develop well. So with that, I think we're right on track to have a little break. And so after the break, we're going to come back and do some question and answer. I know I did a lot of talking, and I want to hear some questions from you. Then I'll respond, and then I have a few discussion questions for us to think about. I think we're on schedule.